Greetings and welcome to the Virtual Moral Leadership Conference, our last day. I'm Kathleen Patterson, and we are so pleased that you've joined us throughout the week. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Corné Bekker, and we're going to talk a little bit about a phenomenal leader who recently just passed away. At the time of this taping, he passed away yesterday. And his life and his legacy is something that we wanted to talk about. And of course, we're talking about Nelson Mandela. Dr. Bekker, you are South African.
Correct, yes.
And you had a front row seat to Nelson Mandela, to apartheid, to him as a leader, to his style as a president.
Right.
Tell us about your front row seat experience.
I obviously grew up in South Africa, and I grew up under the apartheid regime. And I remember the first time I heard the name being mentioned, Nelson Mandela. At that point in time, there was quite a fair bit of indoctrination that was happening during our schooling. And I remember Nelson Mandela being mentioned as a terrorist. I think that's the word that was used. And it was so bizarre because now that you look back and you realize, well, it was never true. Of course it was not true. And then, of course, when I went to college, that was a time period that things started to change dramatically within Southern Africa. And I remember 1990 when he was released from prison. And the next number of years, 1990, 91, 92, 93, were very difficult times in South Africa. And it became very clear to me, at least as a young white man, that not only did things change dramatically, but that the country was almost on a knife's edge. That it could have gone literally the other way, that at some point all of these people that have been systematically oppressed, and not only oppressed, but certainly abused and discriminated against, that they could rise up and take revenge. There was so much pain, so much bitterness in the country. And I remember 1993, Chris Hani, who was a very, very famous freedom fighter with the ANC at that moment in time, was assassinated. I remember that day.
For our audience, tell us what the ANC is.
Right. The ANC, of course, is the African National Congress. This is this organization, political organization, that Nelson Mandela was one of the founder members of. And we're speaking about the 40s and 50s.
Sure.
Over here. And anyways, Chris Hani was assassinated, and I remember the anger amongst the people. And it was at that point in time that I think all of us recognized this can turn tomorrow. And not thousands, but maybe hundreds of thousands of people would be killed. And it was Nelson Mandela that rose up during that time and reiterated something that he said over and over and over again. And he said that we have to forgive. That the only way forward is a way of compassion, of unity, and certainly not only unity, but discovering and treasuring the common dignity of every person. He was one of those people that coined the phrase, the Rainbow Nation. I don't know if you've heard that before. To say that if we are going to do this, we have to do this together. And I remember a statement that he made in 1993. He said that the eyes of the world has turned towards South Africa. And we have an opportunity not only to be an example to the rest of Africa, because if we can do this right here, there's an opportunity, there's hope for Africa, but for the rest of the world. And that's one of the reasons why I think Nelson Mandela, what an extraordinary example of what a moral leader looks like. Indeed.
From an American perspective, we often hear Nelson Mandela referred to as Madiba or Tata.
Right.
Can you tell us what those actually are, what they mean?
Right. It's very, very common in South Africa for folks to refer to Nelson Mandela by Madiba. Madiba is his tribal name. It refers to the clan of the group of people that he comes from, or he came from. Of course, Nelson Mandela was born and grew up within the Xhosa tribe in the southeastern part, the southeastern Cape province of Southern Africa. And the fact that people would refer to him as Madiba is going to tell you something about the social philosophy of Southern Africans, and particularly Xhosa folk. In South Africa, there is a social philosophy that undergirds most African kind of tribal understandings of identity. it's a social philosophy that's called Ubuntu.
Yes.
And of course that word Ubuntu is, or that construct is found in other places in Southern Africa. In Kenya, for instance, it's called Warambie. And Ubuntu literally means this. The best way to translate it is humaneness or kindness, treating people with dignity. And maybe the best way to describe it is to compare it with typical Western philosophy of identity. In the West, we would say, I think, therefore I am. I am identified by my own achievements, by what I have done. But yet in African social philosophy, it's rather, I belong, therefore I am. And the fact that people would call him Madiba would say that, yes, this person is important, but actually what makes him important is his connection with his family, connection with his own people. The same you might have seen on Facebook all in the last 2 days. It would say, rest in peace, Tata.
Yes.
That's the word that you use. Tata is a colloquial African word that means papa or father, a father of the nation. And in Africa, Southern Africa in actual fact, it is very common to refer to an older person by the word tata. This idea that it's a father figure and this common respect, even though this person is not your family member or not related to you, we refer to this person with this term of absolute respect. And once again, you see this kind of Ubuntu understanding that we treat everybody with great respect, with dignity, but above all, that we are connected with one another.
Mm-hmm. That's really precious, really it is. It just shows the love from Nelson Mandela and obviously the respect. Our predominant audience is going to be from a leadership perspective.
Correct.
And obviously you and I are well versed into the leadership theories and styles. Right. Your front row seat has afforded you an opportunity to view Nelson Mandela in a way that none of us have.
Right.
Would you share with us what you believe his leadership style was?
Right. I think if we were to compare Nelson Mandela with all the different leadership theories that are out there, I'm not entirely sure that any of those leadership theories actually fit.
I find him fitting in a lot of the categories.
Right.
I can't figure it out.
And so if I have to think transformational, yes, obviously. Some aspects of servant leadership, yes. Charismatic leadership, definitely. Mm. In my mind, I think Nelson Mandela embodied two extraordinary characteristics of two very important forms of leadership. He was certainly a man of extraordinary charisma. I've been in several meetings where he was present, and it was always interesting to me that he would walk into the building and you could feel the ripple effect. I can honestly say I've never been in the presence of a person that had such a great gift for charisma and would use it for good. But at the same time, he had extraordinary humility. And I almost want to say, not only a downward mobility, but a humaneness connected with his humility. And it's this, I think, extraordinary mixture of charisma and yet being very humble in his leadership that produced a form of leadership that is unmatched in the rest of Africa. It's not often, as an African I want to say this, it's not often, Dr. Patterson, that we hear good stories out of Africa. And Nelson Mandela made such an extraordinary change. That here was somebody with all the power, all the privilege, all the charisma, and yet after 4 years of leadership stepped away. And I remember when he stepped away, he made this statement. He said, when you have to challenge a process as a leader, you stand in front. When you are attacked, you stand in front. But when you celebrate, you stand at the back and push others forward. And when you study his leadership, you would often see him do that. He was not afraid to take personal risks to stand for what he believed in. He was ready to go to jail for the rest of his life to go through extraordinary torture and pain and suffering, lose his family. Imagine what it's like to be in prison for 27 years, and for most of that time period have had no expectation that he would ever leave. Extraordinary risk. But at the same time, that when he finally was let out and power was, in essence, transferred to him, he didn't hold on to that power and rather say, now is the opportunity to promote others and to lead them forward. I think it's that combination of strong charisma and humility that made him, maybe one can speak about a modified version of charismatic leadership theory. Maybe one can speak about an intensive African form of servant leadership. Maybe. Those, I think, attributes certainly is what stand out for me when I think of Nelson Mandela.
When I was in your office this morning, I noticed a picture on your wall of you with a group of other people, but specifically you were standing right with Nelson Mandela.
Indeed.
Tell us about that picture, but also tell us about what you feel his legacy is.
When I graduated from my doctoral program, we were a very small cohort, which is very typical of doctoral programs in Southern Africa. And we had a small reception, and I guess there were maybe 7 or 8, maybe 9 students graduating, at least within a doctoral program. And I remember turning around hearing his voice.
Wow.
And he was in the vicinity. His wife was given an honorary doctoral degree, and unbeknownst to anyone, he decided to pitch. And this is something very often that he would do. He just did not respond, and he decided he was there. And so he came to the reception, and I remember very vividly, he spent about 10-15 minutes with every student. And I remember very vividly him walking up to me. Now you can imagine what this is like. This is 2001. This is right after the time period that he served as president. This is now the time that he stepped back. And I remember that he approached me and spoke to me in my mother tongue, Afrikaans, which of course is 17th century kind of what I call kitchen Dutch, bad Dutch, street Dutch. And you have to remember that this was the language of the oppressor. This is the reason why the Soweto riots took place in 1976, because these kids did not want to be schooled in a language different than their own. And yet here's a man of international fame and stature, and he spoke to me on my terms. And I remember that he asked me a number of questions. He asked me about my parents. He asked me about my siblings. He asked me about my church. He asked me about my pastor. He knew my pastor. And then he asked, what did I study? What did I work on? And then gave me some words of what I could do to help South Africa.
Wow.
It was a very humbling experience at that time. And of course, all that you could do is that you could just feel absolutely humbled. There were no airs about him. He was one of those people that when he spoke to you, you were the only person in the room. And I remember, because he came beforehand, there was a reception beforehand, the ceremony had to start late because he would not stop talking to people. And they were waiting for him. And he very simply would say, and this is a very typical kind of Ubuntu-inspired approach, he would say, people are more important than time. When I think of the legacy, South Africa today is at the crossroads. And I have deep concerns about Africa as a continent. I have deep concerns for Southern Africa. And my deepest concern is that our leaders would examine the life of somebody like Nelson Mandela. And that they would ask the question, what does it take to ultimately be a moral leader? It was very clear to me that Mr. Mandela spent 27 years in prison thinking, reflecting, how will we lead when we get out? How will we be different? And I think there are a number of incredible legacy points that his life leaves for us, for me personally, it's this action of stopping, thinking, reflecting. So often when it comes to leadership, we run to leadership because of the privilege, the power, the prestige, and not stop for long enough to ask the question, how can I help? What are the changes that I can bring? What are the challenges that I can face? What are the transformational aspects that I can bring to this thing called leadership? And in my mind, this is the legacy that Nelson Mandela will leave. My prayer is that we would move beyond the icon of Madiba,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
and that we will ask the same questions that he asked. My prayer for South Africa is hopefully it will not take 27 years. But I hope that we will make the time right now to ask that question.
Powerful.
It is indeed.
Dr. Bekker, as we end,
Yes.
tell us about next year's Virtual Moral Leadership Conference.
Well, we've spent a number of years, as you know, Dr. Patterson, and for our audience, in deeply reflecting on what is moral leadership. We spent some time the first year looking at the vices, then we looked at the virtues. Mm-hmm. We spent some time last year looking at the 10 Commandments. This year we're looking at profiles of leadership. Next year we want to spend some time asking the question how moral leadership can challenge our world. How moral leadership can be part of the solution of the problems that we face. And so in short, we're going to call it Christian leadership to change the world, or moral leadership
I like
to
that
change
motto.
the world. Yes, of course, it's close to what we want to do here at Regent.
Sure.
And we can invite people and scholars and practitioners to deeply reflect on the cultural wars that we are fighting, not only in North America, but in the rest of the world. The very famous sociologist Emile Durkheim coined a phrase to describe, I think, what it is that we're experiencing. He called this decline in morals, anomie. He spoke of anomie as the erosion of values and norms. And we want to invite folks next year to reflect on how moral leadership could be part of the solution. How do we challenge the world?
Wonderful. Well, we thank you, Dr. Bekker, for joining us, and we thank each of you for joining us this week. So we hope that you will join us next year at the Virtual Moral Leadership Conference.